Hello friends, in the series which we are doing on history of India from 1700 to 1950, today we'll talk about the Socio-Religious Reform Movements. In the earlier lecture on the Socio-Religious Reform Movements, we talked about some of the concerns which were raised by the religious reform movement leaders at that point of time. And we find that in the Indian society, largely we talked about that how the concerns related to the women, for that matter, or the issue of caste system or untouchability, they were foremost. And these kinds of distinctions which were there in the basis of caste or, for that matter, untouchability or gender, they were being addressed by some of the Socio-Religious Reform Movement leaders at that point of time. And they raised these issues, because of which many times we find that legislations they were being brought about at that point of time. We also see that in the context of India, socio-religious reform movements, they were linked because many of the social issues, they had some kind of a religious basis, and in the religious sphere we find that how religion is considered as a way of life. So society and religion, they were in a way interlinked, and at the same time we also find that India was being governed by the colonial rulers, because of which they considered the Indians as backward, and in a way they felt that Indians were not fit enough to rule themselves. And how this kind of situation also brought about the idea of national consciousness among the Indians, and they realized that unless they will be able to in a way give them a befitting reply in the framework of in a way changing their own kinds of evils which were there in the society and reform their own society at their own level, then they will not be able to fight the British rule as well. And we see that some of the people like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, for that matter, who initiated the reform in the context of removal of sati, or Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, who talked about the remarriage of the widows. And we also talked in the framework of the transitional and acculturative movements, as talked about by Kenneth Jones in the earlier lecture. And in the framework of Arya Samaj, we talked about that how go back to the Vedas was their concern, and the Shuddhi movement which was initiated at that point of time. And when one is talking about the impact and responses scheme, then one finds that how some of the scholars they saw that the socio-religious reform movements could be seen in a way of some kind of a reflex action brought about by the kind of reforms or the legislations which were brought about by the British, and Indians they were doing it on their own. In the context of the reform or revival, we find that the Hindu revivalism is an inapt expression, because the Hinduism itself was never really dead. And that is why some considered revivalism to be a misnomer in that sense. And others, those who have argued or in a way criticized this thing, they have said that how even going by its literal meaning, revival would suggest not so much the return of the dead as the revitalization of that which was seen to be dying. So these kinds of ideas, they were being talked about with regard to the issues of the reform or revival. And nationalist leaders like Lala Lajpat Rai, for that matter, he said that the entire revivalist movement was based on the belief that many rational and useful aspects of the past Hindu civilizations, if brought back, could be potentially useful as well. And he said that far from attempting to replicate past in toto, the revivalist programs, they called for the rejection of its regressive elements not suitable for modern life. So he said that the people, they were aware, the reformers, they were aware, and they did not want to support the regressive elements which were there in the society. And scholars like Panikkar, they say that it is important to remember that supporting the traditional culture was not cultural revivalism, but cultural self-defense. So he is right in that sense, because the threat was from the British rule, and how the people, they in a way have to support their culture and they have to defend it, so it could be seen in that particular context. And there are scholars like Amiya P. Sen, who has argued that we are now more aware than ever of the common class origins of the reformers and revivalists, and of how under conditions peculiar to colonialism, rosy reformist moods could soon change into revival as well. So we find that there were debates with regard to these kinds of ideas, whether we should see them in the framework of the reform or in the framework of the revival, and the historians, they have their own arguments with regard to that. And when one is talking about reform, then one sees that how the women's issues, they were at the center, as we have talked earlier as well, whether it was concerned with sati or widow remarriage, against child marriage, against female infanticide, women's education, polygamy, mismatched marriages, all of them, these kinds of issues, they were concerned with the issues of women. And reformers, they were very well aware within their family and within the society, and they promoted their women folk to take up education. And at the same time, we also find that they realized that over a period of time, the changes would definitely come in the society. And with regard to these kinds of concerns, it was very important and imperative that how consciousness among the people was also to be created apart from the legal remedy which was being provided by the British rulers. And when one is talking about the issues of women, then we find that if we want to in a way divide the movement of the women, then in the first phase, that was the period of the 19th century, and we see that the reforms, they were being initiated by men, those who wanted to improve the status of the women, and in a way wanted them to go beyond their role which was in the home. And in that sense, reformers like Ram Mohan Roy or Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, they played their part. And when you talk about the issues, then the removal of sati, raising the age of marriage, or the initiation of the widow remarriage, these were some of the legislations which we find during the 19th century. And at the same time, we also see that there were other certain traditional or regressive elements in the society, those who did not want that these kinds of reforms should come in the society. For example, Dharma Sabha, which was initiated by Radhakant Dev, so it was not in the favor of the sati legislation for that matter. And there were others also, those who did not intend that the age of marriage should be increased. So we have to see that these were initial days with regard to the reforms. And in the first phase, that how men, they were in a way involved in terms of bringing about change for women. And this kind of an initiation, later we find that how women, they took over the first, rather the second phase, where we find that the movement which was initiated by men, it was taken over by women, and they were in a way seeing that how some kind of concessions could be sought for women, and they were also seeking the promises of support for the legislative changes as well. And some of the women leaders, those who in a way came to the public sphere, Bhikaji Kama, Sarojini Naidu for that matter, and these women leaders, when they were seen by other women, that how they were participating in the various kinds of movements, or even for that matter the national movement, then they were also in a way inspired. And we find that huge participation of women in the civil disobedience movement in 1930 and in the later movements as well. But even before that, we find that women, they had participated in the non-cooperation movement in 1920 as well, and from thereafter we find that their participation increases. And another phase which we were talking about was when the All India Women's Conference or All India Women's Organization, which was being created in the context of bringing about some kind of policy for them and making some kind of efforts for them. And this was seen in 1927 when this organization was initiated, and how it led to the equality of citizenship by the Constitution in 1950. But we also see that there were certain limitations to such kind of measures which were being taken, because the movement was largely seen to be elite in orientation, and the expectations and the requirements of the women at other economic and social levels, they were not in a way being taken into account. So these two phases which we have talked about, and the third phase was the phase which was there in the recent times, and how the evolving of the broad alliance of women at all different levels, it was being thought about in this particular phase, and some kind of a new direction and dynamism was given to the movement. And we find that during this particular period, self-help groups, they were being created, so that the women, they could get a lot of support from these self-help groups. And we find that so many concerns in the recent times, private enterprises for that matter, they were being initiated because of these self-help groups, where some kind of support was being given by the government in the framework of the loans which were being given to them, or for that matter some of the non-governmental organizations, they were also involved in providing support to these female groups. And because of this kind of an aspect, we find that the focus was on bringing together women from all sections of society on one platform. And women empowerment was one of the concerns of this particular period, that how women, they have to be empowered through by providing them jobs at different levels. We also see that when one is talking about the position of women in the society, there are a lot of ideas which have been discussed among the historians and social scientists, where we find that the one is with regard to image and the reality, and where we find that how women, they are being viewed in the society, how they are being worshipped in the form of deities in the society. And in the framework of reality, we find that there is a lot of discrimination on the basis of gender, then the domestic violence or other kinds of violence which women have to in a way handle. So this kind of disparity or dichotomy, it exists in the society with regard to the image and the reality. And we find that when one is talking about the kind of reforms which were to be brought about in the society, so these reforms were in harmony with both the natural law and the dictates of reason as well. And we find that the first generation of the Western educated young men, they had evoked reason as the touchstone for both ideas as well as the action. And scholars like Sumit Sarkar, they have argued that the reformers, they sought only limited and controlled emancipation of their women folk. So we find that scholars, they have tried to see that the reformers also did not want to in a way go in a full throttle, rather they were only seeking only a kind of a limited and controlled emancipation of their women. So they were in a way did not want to bring about that kind of a change which they could not control, as has been argued by some of the scholars. And we also see scholars like N. Panikkar who have argued that the socio-cultural regeneration was only occasioned by the colonial presence but not created by it. And this particular view in a way neglects the colonial influence in generating a scientific temperament. And scholars like Sumit Sarkar, they have argued that the Hindu tradition had always combined a very considerable degree of abstract freedom with insistence upon social conformity, and Ram Mohan maintained this kind of a dichotomy. So we find that the scholars, those who have argued that the kind of changes which came in the Indian society, they came only because of the colonial rule, because the colonial rule brought about those changes, it introduced those legislations because of which the change could come. But we find that legislation alone is not enough in that sense to bring about any kind of a change. And it was also some kind of a coincidence that the colonial presence was there when the socio-cultural regeneration of the society was happening, but it was not the result of the colonial presence, as has been argued by Panikkar. And we find that how British, they have in a way tried to take the credit of bringing about the kind of changes which came in the Indian society with regard to the scientific temperament. And scholars like Sarkar, as has been argued earlier as well, that how the Hindu tradition was talking about the freedom as well as conformity, and it was up to the individual to in a way realize that even if one has that kind of a freedom, but also has to conform to the social norms as well. And Ram Mohan Roy was no different from others, and he also wanted to maintain this kind of an issue. And some of the things which have been discussed is that how issues of men, they were not being discussed at this point of time. So they were not being discussed because of the fact that how the past image of men would have raised the questions of the class and also of the subjugated Indian male in the present, that how the Indian male was under the colonial rule. And even on the question of women, we find that any fundamentally radical approach would have raised the question of position of majority of women of the lower classes as well, because we find that initial movement was largely elitist, and the coming together of all women on one platform was still a dream in the 19th century. And that is how we find that the question of women was a central issue over the social reform in the debates in the 19th century. And scholars like Partha Chatterjee, they have argued that nationalism had resolved women's question in complete accordance with the preferred goals. And some kind of a resolution was built around the separation of the domain of culture with the two spheres, material and spiritual, which were condensed into outer Bahar and inner Ghar, that is home and world. So we find that how this kind of a domain of Ghar and Bahar, it was being created in those times, and women, they had to live within the domain of Ghar or inside, and how men, they had to go out in the outer domain which was Bahar, and this outer domain was considered to be material in nature and the inner domain was considered to be spiritual in nature. So this kind of a dichotomy was created, and when one is talking about that how the new women of today's times, they were culturally far more superior to the women, those who were in the Western countries. So white women, they were in a way not considered to be spiritually superior than the Indian women. So Indian women, they had to in a way conform to the kind of ideas which were being there with regard to the social practices. And in that sense, this kind of a cultural superiority which was being assigned to them, they had to maintain that as well. And we find that how the attainment by her own efforts of a superior national culture was the work of the women's newly acquired freedom. So women, they were free, but at the same time they had to in a way maintain the superior national culture, the kind of pedestal on which they were being kept in comparison to the other women, those who were the white women. And we find that this was a central ideological strength of the nationalist resolution of the women's question as well. And how in the political sphere we find that how the political participation of women in the various movements which were launched during this time, so it was seen as an extension of their traditional role as well. And Gandhi felt that the women had greater capacity to resist the temptations of the foreign rule and to suffer non-violently for their beliefs as well. So we find that Gandhi says that with women, national movement will be linked to every home in India. And that is how Gandhi sees the national movement. And when he talks about the participation of women in the national movement, then he says that when women will be there in the national movement, that the entire household will be involved. The children, they will be involved in the national movement. They will come to know about what all was happening with regard to the national movement in the country. So in that sense, Gandhi's ideas, where he talks about that how women, when they will participate in the national movement, or political participation of the women was merely as some kind of an extension of their traditional role. We also see that especially in the 20th century, when films came, we find that so many films they were being made which were dealing with the issues of women, and how these films, they were also trying to reflect the society, and at the same time these films, they were trying to, in a way, ask the society that the issues of women, they need urgent attention, and the kind of changes which were required, they were to be made in the society, because the social change itself is a very slow kind of a process, where you find that the kind of contribution which was made by the leaders in the 19th century and the earlier part of the 20th century, it continued even after independence. And when we talk about some of the films of this particular time, for example, Achut Kanya in 1936 for that matter, or Achut in 1940, Duniya Na Mane in 1939, Dahej in 1950. All these films, they were making some kind of a plea for bringing about change in the society. Achut Kanya was dealing with the issue of untouchability and the caste system which was existing in the society. Similar was the case of Achut in 1940. And Amar Jyoti, for example, in 1934 was talking about bringing about any kind of a change with regard to the practices or customs in the religious sphere. And Duniya Na Mane, for that matter, was talking in the framework of removal of the mismatched marriages which were happening in the society. So these kinds of concerns, for that matter, were very relevant during the colonial period and thereafter as well. Admi, for example, which was made by V. Shantaram in 1939, was again talking within that framework, where prostitutes was being loved by a policeman, and how her honor, how her life was to be in a way changed or transformed in the society. So we find that such kind of picturizations, such kind of films which came, they were very relevant from the point of view of the society, and the kind of changes which they brought about in the later times was also very important. One of the films called Dahej, which was made in 1950 by V. Shantaram for that matter, he later argued that when the members of the Legislative Assembly of Bihar, they were being shown this film, many of them they were moved by this particular film, and later an anti-dowry law was brought in the Bihar Legislative Assembly. So the credit may not be given to only this picture, but definitely when the members, they saw this particular film, as has been argued by V. Shantaram, that definitely they must have been influenced by such kind of film as well. So when one is talking about the socio-religious reform movements, we find that how these kinds of concerns of women and the caste, they were very important, and a lot of change which came with regard to the position of women in the society was the result of these socio-religious reform movements which were initiated in the 19th century by the reformers. And we also talked about the various kinds of phases of the movement, that how in different phases, especially in the first phase when men, they were definitely playing an important role in terms of women's issues, and in the second phase we find that how women, they come to the forefront. But despite that, we find that not all women from all sections of society, they were on one platform with regard to the socio-religious reform theme. But over a period of time, the reform movements, they broadened their approach, and we find that more and more women from all sections of the society, they participated in such movement. We also see that the question of women emancipation was there in 19th century, and in 20th century we find that it becomes more important to see it in the framework of the women empowerment. And women empowerment, if it will happen, then we will find that the economic independence which will come to women will definitely improve their condition or position in the society, and that is how nowadays generally it is being talked in the framework of the women empowerment. We also talked about that how these movements, they were talking about the ideas of rationalism and humanism, and they were very relevant from the point of view of the kind of excesses which were being committed within the framework of either the caste system or in the framework of the kind of treatment which was being meted out to women. So all these socio-religious reform movements, they have been seen by the scholars within the framework of the debates, whether the impact response scheme or in the framework of the reform or revival. And historians, they have argued within that particular framework that how movements definitely made an impact on the society, and how these movements, they became some sort of inspiration for the later movements as well, that in the 20th century we find that Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, for that matter, or we find Jyotiba Phule himself in the 19th century was very relevant in the framework of the socio-religious reform movements. So all of them, they in a way contributed to bring about change in the society, and over a period of time we find that these kinds of changes, they have been witnessed even after 1950, when Constitution was promulgated. We find that so many changes, they have come in the society as well, and with those changes we have seen that many laws they have been created with regard to the situation of women in society. For example, many of the laws which are concerned in the context of today's times, for example, the domestic violence, which is a recent law which has come. So we have to see that how reforms, they are some sort of a evolving process, and these changes, they happen over a period of time, they do not happen overnight. So in that sense, the reforms which were initiated in the 19th century, they continued over a period of time, and in the 20th century also they needed a lot of change. And with the coming of the Constitution in 1950 and thereafter, we have seen that the process of reform has not stopped. Rather, we find that many more reforms, they have been introduced in the recent times. For example, the removal of triple talaq in the recent times is also some sort of a evolutionary kind of a thing which has happened over a period of time, because the earlier changes which have come with regard to the changes in the society in the context of the socio-religious reforms, they were cemented, and then one could think about the new kind of changes which are required from today's times. So this kind of a relevance of the reforms is an important aspect which will continue even in the times to come, for that matter, because we'll find that many kind of evils which creep in the society are an important concern. So we'll talk about these kinds of issues in our further discussions as well. Thank you very much.